I am responding to petition for relief from sex offender reporting, now before the Josephine County Circuit Court. Case number 91-CR-0281. State of Oregon versus Matthew P. Wright.
I am the victim of Mr. Wright's sexual abuse, molestation, and I will always be the victim of his choices and decisions that he made to sexually abuse me when I was a very young child, an innocent child that he chose to prey upon, an innocent child who had no opportunity to defend myself or stop his sick, perverted actions that he chose to impose upon me. His choices and decisions, ones that I have had to live with, cope with, and come to terms with, not only as a child, but all during my teen years, which are difficult enough without having the added burden of trying to understand why an adult, one who I trusted, would choose to do those things to me. Those were things that I had no choice in. Every day I bear the consequences, if you will, of his choices. As a parent of 2 children, I try to impress upon them that every action has a consequence, and that when they choose a behavior, it will carry with it either good or bad consequences. A concept which is simplistic in nature and one that every adult knows and understands. When Mr. Wright made his choice to act upon his thoughts, undoubtedly he knew that there would be very far-reaching and long-lasting consequences of those behaviors and actions if he were caught, and yet he chose to act upon them. Mr. Wright knew full well that his behaviors were wrong and unacceptable, not only in society, but also morally. I can say with all confidence that he knew they were morally wrong, all during the time that he was committing these acts to fulfill his lusts and predatory sexual desires upon me as a young child. He was also portraying himself as a Christian man to the people around him, attending church at Central Christian Center, and even participating in the church orchestra every Sunday during the praise and worship services. He sat under the teachings of Pastor Mac Evans every week, portraying himself as a godly man, and yet all the while behind closed doors and in secret he was carrying out those most ungodly behaviors and actions upon an innocent child, one whom he called his daughter. Even after moving to Oregon and becoming actively involved in the church that his brother Dave Wright pastored in Applegate, Oregon, again portraying himself to everyone around him as the godly man, he continued to carry out these sick and perverted behaviors behind closed doors. Because of the fear that Mr. Wright created within me over anyone finding out the behaviors and actions to which he was exposing me, it took almost 3 years, and being several hundred miles away from him, before I finally had the courage to confide in my mother the things that he had done to me. During the time Mr. Wright was sexually abusing me, I had no control or choice in what was happening. But now, as an adult, I not only have a voice in regard to Mr. Wright's petition before this court, but I have an obligation to speak out loudly and aggressively against it. In doing so, I pray that the court will deny his petition and require him to continue to report to the state of Oregon every year for the remainder of his life. For you see, those behaviors, actions, and choices that he made to sexually abuse me, all the while knowing that they were wrong, are things that I will have to live with every year for the remainder of my life. So what if it is inconvenient for him? Does he think it has been convenient for me to live with what he has done to me as a child? So what if it makes his life a little harder if he has to remain accountable for those wrong choices that he made? Does he think that his choices, ones I had no control over, made my life any easier? So what if it may be embarrassing for him if his neighbors or friends discover his dirty little secrets because he has to register as a sex offender? Does he think it was not embarrassing for me to have to live with the emotional scars that he imposed upon me from his sexual abuse of me? I am sure Mr. Wright has most likely portrayed himself to the outside world as a godly man who is living the life of a Christian now. If they do know of or have discovered he sexually abused, molested a child in the past, I am sure he would have them believe that he is not that man today, that he has changed. How is that any different from the man he portrayed himself to be all during the time that he was continuing to sexually abuse his own stepdaughter, not only while living in Joplin, Missouri, but also after moving to Grants Pass, Oregon, under the pretense of helping out in his own brother's church? There is no difference. Of course, Mr. Wright is not going to admit to the court if he is having sexually deviant thoughts of young children, even to this day. How is that any different than when he entered an Alford plea before the court many years ago, thus not admitting to having sexually abused, molested me as a child, even though today he knows full well that he did? There is no difference. I believe that most sex offenders are never completely rehabilitated, just as I believe that an alcoholic is always an alcoholic, even though they may not be currently drinking. I also believe that a sex offender is always a sex offender, even though they may not currently be subjecting a child to sexual abuse, molestation. Based on Mr. Wright's past denial and past behavior of hiding behind the church and the label of Christianity to cover up his sexual misconduct, I do not believe he would ever truly and completely be rehabilitated or changed. I believe that the only thing that has kept him from reoffending is knowing he had to stay out of trouble for a certain number of years, and then, after that, he could petition the court for relief from sex offender reporting, and if it was granted, he would then basically be free from all repercussions of his wrong choices, behaviors, and actions. Along those same lines, I would ask the court, what is it that I, as his victim, can do to be free from the repercussions of his sexual abuse and emotional scars that he imposed upon me? I believe that having some form of accountability, such as sex offender reporting, is a deterrent to keep a past sex offender from reoffending as easily as they otherwise might. And therefore I feel there is a very high possibility that if his petition were to be granted, and he no longer had any accountability of any kind to the court, that it would be a wide open door for him to reoffend. That belief is voiced out of concern for other innocent children who would be at risk of being sexually abused, molested by Mr. Wright, just as I was, and subject them to painful memories and emotions for the rest of their life that no child should ever have to endure, just as I have endured. I hope that the court will not impose that kind of open season upon the children of its community. I pray that the court would not risk putting a life sentence on still yet another innocent child simply because Mr. Wright feels inconvenienced by having to register annually with the state of Oregon. Is it not time that adults who deliberately and knowingly impose their deviant sexual desires upon innocent children be required to suffer the consequences for those behaviors and choices for the same length of time that their victims are subject to the emotional scars caused by the behaviors and actions of the perpetrators, that being a lifetime sentence? I hereby respectfully request that the court deny his petition for relief from sex offender reporting and require that he continue to register annually.